"Sir, I can't give you the veteran's discount." The 19-year-old cashier didn't even look up from her register as she spoke to the elderly man standing patiently in line. "You don't look like a real veteran to me." Behind him, other customers began to murmur and shift uncomfortably. The old man just nodded quietly, reached for his wallet with hands that bore scars no one bothered to notice. But 3 people back in line, a man in a business suit suddenly went rigid, staring at those same scarred hands that had once pulled him from a burning Huey in the jungles of Vietnam. Welcome to Warrior Voices. Before we continue this incredible story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world you are watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of our warrior community. The Save Mart on Maple Street had seen better days. Built in the 1980s when the neighborhood was still considered suburban rather than transitional, the store now served a mix of working families, elderly residents on fixed incomes, and young people who couldn't afford the newer supermarkets across town. The fluorescent lights hummed with the persistence of old electrical systems, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glare that made everyone look tired. Frank Morrison moved through the store with the measured pace of someone for whom every step required conscious effort. At 71, his body carried the accumulated weight of 7 decades, though most of that weight was invisible to casual observers. His left leg bore the ghost of shrapnel from a mortar round that had exploded 30 feet from his position during the Tet Offensive. His right shoulder, which he favored unconsciously, had been dislocated when he dove into a crater to drag a wounded soldier to safety. His hands, weathered and marked with small scars, had once performed surgery under impossible conditions with nothing but a flashlight and whatever medical supplies he could scavenge. But to the other customers in Save Mart that Tuesday afternoon, Frank Morrison was just another elderly man moving slowly through the aisles, taking too long to decide between brands of soup, carefully checking prices with the attention of someone living on a fixed income. His clothes were clean but worn, a flannel shirt that had seen many washings, jeans that fit properly but showed their age, work boots that were comfortable rather than fashionable. Frank's shopping cart contained the essentials that had sustained him through another month: canned soup, white bread, instant coffee, a small package of ground beef that would stretch into several meals, and a bag of apples that represented his primary source of fresh produce. The total would come to $31.47 before any discounts, a calculation he had performed in his head as he shopped, keeping careful track of every penny. The store offered a 10% military discount on Tuesdays, a policy that had been in place for 3 years since the corporate office decided to honor veteran customers. For Frank, that discount meant the difference between a full week of meals and having to skip lunch for the last 2 days before his Social Security check arrived. It wasn't pride that made him ask for the discount. It was necessity, wrapped in the quiet dignity of someone who had long ago learned to accept help when it was offered. Emma Rodriguez had been working at Save Mart for 8 months, a job she had taken after graduating high school when her plans for college were delayed by family financial problems. She was a serious worker, punctual and responsible, someone who followed store policies exactly as written in the employee handbook. The military discount policy was clear. Customers requesting the discount needed to provide valid military ID or documentation of service. Too many people, according to her manager, tried to take advantage of discounts they hadn't earned. Emma had seen all types during her months behind the register. Genuine veterans who presented crisp military ID cards with obvious pride. Middle-aged men who talked loudly about their service while producing dog tags or discharge papers. Occasional customers who tried to claim military discounts without any documentation, usually backing down quickly when asked for proof. She had been trained to be polite but firm about the requirements. When Frank approached her register that Tuesday afternoon, Emma was already thinking about her break, which was overdue, and the homework she needed to complete before her evening shift at her second job. She began scanning his items with practiced efficiency: soup, bread, coffee, ground beef, apples. The total appeared on her screen. $31.47. That'll be $31.47, sir, she said, already reaching for the plastic bags beneath her register. Frank pulled out his worn leather wallet, the same one he had carried since 1975, and began counting bills carefully. Then he looked up with the apologetic expression of someone asking for a favor. "Excuse me, miss, but I was wondering if the military discount applies today? I served in Vietnam." Emma's response was automatic, shaped by months of following protocol and the casual skepticism that retail work had taught her. She glanced up at Frank, taking in his appearance with the quick assessment she had learned to make when customers requested discounts or returned items without receipts. "Sir, I can't give you the veteran's discount. You don't look like a real veteran to me." The words hung in the air between them. Frank's expression didn't change. He had heard variations of this response before, from store clerks, government officials, and even family members who couldn't reconcile the quiet man they knew with the idea of military service. He simply nodded and began counting out exact change. "That's fine," he said quietly. "I understand." But behind Frank, the response had created a ripple of discomfort among the customers waiting in line. An elderly woman with a cart full of cat food shifted uncomfortably. A mother with 2 young children looked embarrassed on Frank's behalf. And 3 people back in line, Dr. Thomas Chen stopped mid-reach for his own wallet. His attention suddenly focused entirely on the man at the register. Dr. Chen was 52 years old, a successful cardiologist who lived in the affluent part of town and shopped at Save Mart only when he needed something quickly and didn't want to drive to the upscale markets near his home. He wore a tailored business suit even on his day off, carried himself with the confidence of professional success, and generally moved through life with the assurance of someone who had achieved the American dream through education and hard work. But as he watched Frank Morrison count out exact change for his groceries, Dr. Chen was no longer standing in a fluorescent-lit grocery store in suburban America. He was 22 years old again, lying in a muddy crater outside Firebase Charlie, 15 miles northwest of Saigon, with blood seeping from a wound in his abdomen that he knew was going to kill him unless someone performed a miracle. The miracle had arrived in the form of a medic who appeared through the smoke and chaos like something from a fever dream. Working by flashlight and instinct, the medic had performed field surgery that no medical textbook said was possible under those conditions. For 6 hours, while artillery shells exploded around them and small arms fire crackled overhead, the medic had worked to keep Thomas Chen alive until helicopter evacuation could reach their position. Thomas had never learned the medic's full name. In the chaos of evacuation and subsequent medical treatment, that information had been lost. He knew only that the man was called Doc by the other soldiers, that he spoke with a gentle voice even under fire, and that he had hands that could work miracles. Thomas had tried for years to locate his savior through veteran organizations and military records, but without a complete name or unit information, the search had proved fruitless. Now, watching Frank Morrison accept Emma's rejection with quiet dignity, Dr. Chen noticed details that others had missed. The way Frank favored his right shoulder. The precise, economic movements that spoke of someone who had learned to work efficiently under pressure. Most telling of all, the scars on Frank's hands, thin white lines that could have come from shrapnel or from medical instruments used under battlefield conditions. As Frank finished counting his money, Dr. Chen stepped out of line and approached the register. His movement was sudden enough to draw Emma's attention and cause Frank to look up in surprise. "Excuse me," Dr. Chen said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in emergency situations. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." Emma looked defensive, sensing criticism but not sure where it might be coming from. "Sir, store policy requires documentation for military discounts. I was just following the rules." Dr. Chen nodded, but his attention was focused entirely on Frank. "You said you served in Vietnam?" Frank's response was careful, the answer of someone who had learned that claims of military service were often met with skepticism. "Yes, sir. 1968 to 1970. Army medic, 1st Cavalry Division." The words hit Dr. Chen like a physical blow. The 1st Cavalry Division. The dates matched perfectly with his own service. He studied Frank's face more carefully, looking past the decades of aging for the young man who had saved his life. "What was your unit designation?" Dr. Chen asked, his voice becoming more intense. Frank looked confused by the sudden interrogation, but answered honestly. "2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, sir. Mostly worked at forward aid stations, but we got called out for field operations when things got bad." Dr. Chen's hands began to shake. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry had been responsible for medical support in the exact area where he had been wounded. The timeline, the unit, the specialization, everything matched his fragmentary memories of that terrible day. "Firebase Charlie," Dr. Chen said, quietly. "March 15th, 1969. Do you remember that date?" Frank's entire demeanor changed. The careful politeness fell away, replaced by something sharper and more focused. "Yes, sir. I remember that date very well." "There was an artillery attack," Dr. Chen continued, his voice growing stronger as suppressed memories surfaced. "The base was overrun. Casualties were heavy. You performed surgery in a shell crater under enemy fire." By now, the conversation had drawn the attention of everyone within hearing distance. Emma had stopped processing the next customer and was listening with growing confusion. Other customers in line had moved closer, sensing that something significant was happening. Frank studied Dr. Chen's face with the careful attention of someone trying to reconcile present reality with distant memory. "Sir, were you the wounded officer, Lieutenant Chen?" "I was," Dr. Chen said, his voice breaking slightly. "You saved my life that day." The recognition was mutual now. Despite the decades of aging, despite the transformation from young soldier to successful civilian, both men saw clearly across the years to that day when their lives had intersected under the worst possible circumstances. Emma watched this exchange with growing alarm. She didn't understand what was happening, but she sensed that her casual dismissal of Frank's military service had somehow triggered something much larger than a simple disagreement over store policy. "I don't understand," she said, looking from Frank to Dr. Chen and back again. Dr. Chen turned to address her, his voice carrying new authority. "This man is Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison, United States Army, Vietnam veteran. On March 15, 1969, he performed surgery under enemy fire that saved my life and the lives of 6 other wounded soldiers. He's not just a real veteran, he's one of the finest medics who ever served." Emma's face went pale as the implications of her earlier statement became clear. Around them, other customers began to applaud spontaneously. An elderly woman stepped forward and shook Frank's hand. A middle-aged man who had been waiting in the express lane came over to thank him for his service. But Frank seemed overwhelmed by the sudden attention. He had spent decades living quietly, accepting that his service was ancient history that nobody cared about anymore. The idea that his actions in Vietnam still mattered to someone, that they had shaped a life in ways he never knew, was almost too much to process. "Lieutenant Chen," Frank said quietly, "I'm glad you made it home safe. That's all any of us wanted." Dr. Chen shook his head firmly. "Dr. Chen now, and I made it home because of you. I became a doctor because of what you taught me that day about the value of human life and what we owe each other." He turned to Emma, who was still standing behind her register in shock. "Young lady, you need to understand something. The man you just dismissed has saved more lives than most doctors. He deserves not just a discount, but respect and gratitude." Emma found her voice, though it came out smaller than usual. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know. Store policy says." "Store policy," Dr. Chen interrupted, "should account for the fact that heroes don't always look the way you expect them to." Frank, uncomfortable with being the center of attention, tried to defuse the situation. "It's all right, miss. You were just doing your job. Rules are rules." But Dr. Chen wasn't finished. He pulled out his wallet and removed a business card, handing it to Frank. "Staff Sergeant Morrison, I've been looking for you for 54 years. I want you to call me. There are things I need to say. Thanks I need to give properly." Frank accepted the business card with hands that were visibly shaking now. "Sir, you don't owe me anything. I was just doing my job." "Your job was to provide medical care," Dr. Chen corrected. "What you did went far beyond that. You stayed with us for 6 hours under fire. You used your own medical supplies when the aid stations ran out. You carried wounded men to safety when you should have been seeking cover yourself. By now, a small crowd had gathered around the register. Word was spreading through the store that something remarkable was happening. The manager, alerted by the unusual cluster of customers at Register 3, approached to investigate. "Is there a problem here?" the manager asked, clearly concerned about the disruption to normal operations. Dr. Chen addressed the manager with the same authority he brought to hospital board meetings. "The problem is that your employee just denied military discount to a combat veteran who saved American lives in Vietnam. I suggest you review your training procedures for recognizing and honoring military service." The manager, a middle-aged woman named Patricia Williams who had been with Save Mart for 12 years, looked from Emma to Frank to Dr. Chen, trying to understand the situation. "Sir, our policy requires documentation." "Your policy," Dr. Chen said firmly, "just insulted a man who earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star for valor under fire. I'm a witness to his service. I'm the proof of his service." Frank tried again to minimize the situation. "Really, it's fine. I should have brought my discharge papers. That's on me." Dr. Chen turned to him with gentle firmness. "Staff Sergeant Morrison, stop apologizing for other people's ignorance. You earned that discount and a lot more." He pulled out his own wallet and removed several bills. "Emma, is it? Here's payment for Staff Sergeant Morrison's groceries, and I want you to apply the military discount retroactively to every purchase he's made here." Emma looked to her manager for guidance. Patricia Williams nodded slowly. "Apply the discount," she said quietly. "And Emma, please see me after your shift. We need to discuss customer service protocols." As Emma processed the payment and applied the discount, Frank stood quietly to the side, still overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. Dr. Chen approached him again. "Staff Sergeant Morrison, I know this is a lot to take in, but I need you to understand something. Every life I've saved as a doctor, every surgery I've performed, every patient I've helped, all of that exists because you kept me alive on March 15th, 1969. Your actions that day rippled forward through decades." Frank looked at the successful man in front of him, trying to reconcile him with the young lieutenant he remembered. "You became a doctor?" "Cardiothoracic surgeon," Dr. Chen confirmed. "Partly inspired by watching you work under impossible conditions. I've performed over 3,000 surgeries in my career. Every one of those patients owes their life, in part, to what you did for me." The weight of this revelation seemed to settle over Frank like a physical presence. He had spent decades believing that his service in Vietnam was a closed chapter, ancient history that had no bearing on the present. The idea that his actions had influenced someone's entire career, had indirectly saved thousands of lives, was difficult to process. Emma finished processing the transaction and handed Frank his receipt and groceries. "Sir," she said quietly, "I'm really sorry about what I said earlier. I didn't understand." Frank accepted the apology with the same grace he had shown throughout the encounter. "It's all right, miss. We all make mistakes. The important thing is that we learn from them." Dr. Chen wasn't ready to let the matter drop entirely. "Emma, I want you to remember this moment. Real heroes don't always look like what you see in movies. They're often quiet people who did extraordinary things when they were needed, then came home and lived ordinary lives. This man saved American lives in combat, and he deserves to be treated with respect wherever he goes." As Frank prepared to leave, Dr. Chen stopped him one more time. "Staff Sergeant Morrison, please call me. I'd like to take you to lunch if you're willing. There's a lot we need to talk about." Frank nodded, still holding Dr. Chen's business card. "I'll call, sir, and thank you for the groceries and for remembering." "I never forgot," Dr. Chen said firmly. "I just didn't know how to find you." As Frank walked toward the exit, several customers nodded respectfully or offered quiet thanks. Word of what had happened was spreading through the store, and people were beginning to see the elderly man with the worn clothes and careful movements in an entirely different light. Emma watched Frank leave, then turned to her manager. "Mrs. Williams, I really didn't know. He just looked like—" "Like what?" Patricia Williams asked. Emma struggled to find words. "Like just an old man asking for a discount he probably didn't deserve." Mrs. Williams nodded grimly. That's exactly the problem, Emma. You made assumptions based on appearance instead of giving someone the benefit of the doubt. Military service doesn't have a specific look, and heroes don't wear uniforms to the grocery store. Dr. Chen, who had been preparing to leave, overheard the conversation and approached them. "If I may offer a suggestion," he said to Mrs. Williams, "perhaps your store could implement a policy that presumes good faith when customers request military discounts. Make documentation preferred rather than required, and train your staff to treat such requests with respect, even when they can't immediately verify them." Mrs. Williams considered this suggestion. "That's not a bad idea. We could implement a verification system that doesn't require customers to prove their service on the spot." More importantly, Dr. Chen continued, "Train your staff to understand that veterans come in all forms. Some are proud and vocal about their service. Others, like Staff Sergeant Morrison, are quiet and humble. Both deserve equal respect." Over the following weeks, Frank Morrison's life changed in ways he never could have anticipated. Dr. Chen was true to his word, calling within 2 days to arrange lunch. That lunch stretched into 3 hours as two old soldiers shared stories and filled in the gaps of 54 years. Dr. Chen learned that Frank had returned from Vietnam in 1970, used the GI Bill to become a nurse, and spent 30 years working in emergency rooms and trauma centers. He had never married, had no children, and lived on a modest pension supplemented by Social Security. His service in Vietnam was something he rarely discussed, partly because people seemed uncomfortable with the subject, and partly because he had never thought his experiences were particularly noteworthy. Frank learned that Dr. Chen had built a successful medical practice, raised 3 children who were now doctors themselves, and had never forgotten the medic who saved his life. Dr. Chen had established a charitable foundation that provided medical care to underserved communities, partially inspired by watching Frank work with limited resources under impossible conditions. The lunch led to a friendship that enriched both men's lives. Dr. Chen introduced Frank to other Vietnam veterans in the medical community, creating a support network that Frank had never known he needed. Frank's quiet wisdom and perspective on service helped Dr. Chen reconnect with values that had gotten buried under the pressures of professional success. But the changes extended beyond their personal relationship. Dr. Chen used his influence in the medical community to tell Frank's story, not for publicity, but to illustrate points about service, sacrifice, and the quiet heroism that often goes unrecognized. Frank's experience became a teaching tool in medical schools, helping young doctors understand the true meaning of healing and service. SaveMart implemented the policy changes Dr. Chen had suggested, training staff to approach military discount requests with respect and creating a verification system that didn't require veterans to prove their service on the spot. Emma Rodriguez, chastened by her experience with Frank, became one of the most respectful and careful employees when dealing with veteran customers. 6 months after their encounter in the grocery store, Frank received an invitation that surprised him. Dr. Chen's medical foundation was hosting its annual gala, a fundraising event that drew prominent members of the medical community from across the region. Dr. Chen wanted Frank to attend as his guest and to accept a special recognition for his service as a combat medic. Frank's initial reaction was to decline. He wasn't comfortable with formal events or public recognition. But Dr. Chen was persistent, explaining that Frank's story needed to be heard by people who could use it to better understand the true nature of service and sacrifice. The gala was held at a downtown hotel, in a ballroom filled with doctors, nurses, hospital administrators, and community leaders. Frank felt out of place in his borrowed suit, surrounded by people whose lives seemed to exist in a different world from his own. But Dr. Chen stayed close, introducing him to colleagues and explaining his significance without making Frank uncomfortable. When the time came for the recognition ceremony, Dr. Chen took the podium to introduce Frank. His speech was brief but powerful, focusing not on the details of Frank's combat service but on the lasting impact of his actions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Chen said, "I want you to meet someone who taught me the true meaning of medical service. On a terrible day in Vietnam, when conventional medicine wasn't possible, This man showed me that healing is about more than equipment and procedures. It's about courage, dedication, and refusing to give up on human life no matter how desperate the circumstances. He gestured for Frank to join him at the podium. Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison saved my life 54 years ago, making it possible for me to become a doctor and to save thousands of other lives. But more than that, he showed me what it means to serve others without counting the cost. The applause was sustained and respectful. Frank accepted the recognition with characteristic humility, offering brief remarks about the privilege of serving and the importance of taking care of each other. His words were simple but profound, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had lived his values under the most difficult circumstances. After the ceremony, Frank was approached by numerous attendees who wanted to thank him for his service or share their own connections to military medicine. A young resident doctor told him that hearing his story had inspired her to specialize in trauma surgery. A hospital administrator mentioned plans to create a veterans support program based on lessons learned from Frank's experience. But the most meaningful interaction came from an elderly woman who approached Frank near the end of the evening. She introduced herself as Margaret Patterson, the widow of a soldier who had died in Vietnam. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "my husband was wounded near Saigon in 1969. He died before he could be evacuated. I've always wondered if someone tried to save him, if someone cared about him in those final moments. Hearing your story tonight, knowing that there were people like you there, gives me comfort. Thank you for what you did, not just for Dr. Chen, but for all of them." Frank was visibly moved by her words. "Ma'am, I can promise you that someone cared. We all cared. Every medic, every doctor, every soldier, we all cared about bringing everyone home." A year after their initial encounter at SaveMart, Frank Morrison's life had been transformed. His friendship with Dr. Chen had opened doors he never knew existed, connecting him with a community of people who valued his service and experience. He had begun volunteering at a veterans center, sharing his knowledge of trauma medicine with young medics preparing for deployment. More importantly, Frank had rediscovered a sense of purpose that had been missing from his retirement years. His service in Vietnam was no longer ancient history, but living experience that could help and inspire others. The quiet dignity that had sustained him through decades of civilian obscurity now served as a foundation for meaningful contribution to his community. Dr. Chen, meanwhile, had found in Frank a connection to values that his professional success had sometimes obscured. Their friendship reminded him that medical service was about more than technical skill or career advancement. It was about human connection and the willingness to help others regardless of circumstances. The ripple effects of their encounter continued to spread. SaveMart's new policies regarding military discounts became a model for other retailers in the region. Emma Rodriguez had become an advocate for respectful treatment of veterans, using her experience with Frank to train other employees. Several medical students had chosen to specialize in trauma care after hearing Frank's story, carrying forward the values he embodied. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Frank saw himself. For decades, he had believed that his service in Vietnam was a closed chapter, something that belonged to his past rather than his present. His encounter with Dr. Chen had shown him that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. It transforms into other forms of contribution and connection. On quiet evenings in his small apartment, Frank would sometimes look at the business card that Dr. Chen had given him that day in SaveMart. The card had become a symbol of recognition, deferred but not denied, of service remembered and honored. It reminded him that sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen in the most ordinary places, when we least expect them. The grocery store where it all began continued its daily operations, serving customers who had no idea that something extraordinary had happened there. But the employees who had witnessed the encounter between Frank and Dr. Chen carried the memory with them, approaching each customer with a little more respect, a little more awareness that everyone has a story worth hearing. Sometimes heroes shop for groceries. Sometimes they stand patiently in checkout lines, counting exact change and asking politely for discounts they've earned with their blood. Sometimes they're dismissed by people who can't cease appearances to recognize the extraordinary service that shaped ordinary lives. But sometimes, if we're very fortunate, someone who remembers speaks up. Someone who was there, who knows the truth, who refuses to let quiet heroism go unrecognized. Sometimes the circle closes, the debt is acknowledged, and two old soldiers find each other again across the years. This story was brought to you by Warrior Voices. Frank Morrison's journey reminds us that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized and unappreciated, until someone who knows their story speaks up. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever encountered someone whose quiet dignity and service deserved more recognition than they received? Tell us in the comments about the unsung heroes in your life. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.